This is a true story of the frontier. 1840, a time when the world had hard edges and soft mercy in equal measure, when men and women faced the raw face of nature without anything between them and it but their own will. And this is the story of one man, not a general, not a legend, not the kind of man whose name gets carved into stone. Just a man named Thomas Hale, 31 years old, broad shoulders, quiet eyes, the kind of man who walks into a room and you don't notice him until the room is on fire, and then you realize he was the only one who already knew where the door was. He didn't set out to become anyone's hero. He set out on a ship on a gray morning, heading toward waters most men had only read about. He had no way of knowing that before the third night was over, that ship would be gone, that he would be dragging 5 women out of the dark water with his bare hands, that they would wash up on an island without a name, without a road, without a soul who knew they existed. He had no way of knowing that those 5 women were each carrying a child. And he had absolutely no way of knowing that on the 43rd day, sitting by a fire on a shore the world had forgotten, he would make a promise that would cost him everything. And keep it for 7 years. This is that story. Now, to understand what was lost that night, you must first understand what was on that ship. Because these were not 6 ordinary souls who had wandered onto a vessel by accident or desperation. These were 6 people chosen with purpose, gathered together for a mission that the men funding it believed could change the way the Western frontier understood the natural world. A scientific expedition. Quiet, unofficial, funded by a small circle of men in the East who believed that the unmapped coastlines of the far West held secrets, botanical, geographical, medicinal, that no one had yet had the patience or the courage to document properly. They needed people who could survive the journey, people who could do the work, people who were, in every sense of the word, the best at what they did. They found 6. Thomas Hale was not a scientist. He was something more valuable on an expedition like this. He was a man who could keep everyone else alive long enough to do their work. He had spent 12 years as a frontier guide, leading supply missions through territory that most maps still left blank. He could read weather the way scholars read books, not from instruments, but from the sky itself, from the way animals moved, from the pressure in the air before a storm that no one else had felt yet. He could build shelter from nothing, find water where the ground looked dry, navigate by stars with a precision that surprised men who had studied navigation formally. He had been hired not for any single skill, but for the sum of all of them. He was the one who would bring them home. That had always been his job, bringing people home. Rebecca Shaw had trained under one of the finest physicians in the Eastern Territories at a time when women were not supposed to be in those rooms at all. She had walked in anyway. She had a gift for the human body that went beyond what books could teach, an instinct for what was wrong and what was needed that her mentor had called, privately, the finest diagnostic mind he had ever encountered. She had been brought on this expedition as its medical officer, responsible for keeping 5 other people healthy in conditions that would test the limits of what a body could endure. She carried more knowledge in her memory than most frontier towns had in their entire medical supply. Anna Reyes had grown up on land that most people considered wilderness, and she considered home. Her mother had taught her the plants before she could read words, and her grandmother before that, and the women before her in a line that went back further than any written record. She could identify over 400 species of plant by sight alone, which ones healed fever, which ones closed wounds, which ones could sustain a person through a winter with no other food source. The expedition needed someone who could read the natural world of an unmapped coastline and determine, quickly and accurately, what that land could provide. There was no one better alive for that work than Anna Reyes. Mary Caldwell was the expedition's documentarian. Her job was to record everything, in sketches so precise and detailed that scientists back east could study them as reliably as they could study a specimen brought home in a jar. She had an eye that operated like a scientific instrument, capturing proportion and detail with an accuracy that turned her sketchbooks into something closer to maps than art. She had already filled 43 sketchbooks in her career, documenting plant species, coastlines, and geological formations across 3 territories. The men who hired her believed her work on this expedition would become the definitive visual record of the western coastline. Maggie Boone had built her reputation doing something that had no formal title in 1840. She taught survival. Not theory, not the kind of survival that lives in books written by men who had never gone hungry. Real survival, the kind you learn when you have no choice. She had spent 20 years in frontier territory, first as a child trying to keep her family alive after her father died, then as a young woman who discovered she could teach what she had learned, and finally as someone that military expeditions and trading companies hired specifically when they were going somewhere they weren't sure they would come back from. She knew how to build, how to hunt, how to preserve food, how to keep a group of people functioning as a unit when fear was trying to pull them apart. She was, in the truest sense, the expedition's survival architect. And Eliza Turner, the youngest of them, 23 years old, was its recorder of the human story. Not the plants, not the coastline, not the medical observations, the people. She was a writer of the kind that comes along rarely, someone who could sit in a room and within an hour understand every person in it more completely than they understood themselves. She had been hired to keep the expedition's journal, to document not just what they found, but what it felt like to find it, what it cost, what it meant. The men who hired her understood that a scientific record without a human story is just data, and data does not move people. Eliza Turner's words moved people. She would have more to write about than anyone had imagined. These were the 6 who set sail on that gray pewter morning in 1840. 6 people at the top of their particular craft, assembled for a mission that the world would never know had taken place, heading toward waters that none of them had charted, and only one of them, Thomas, always Thomas, was quietly, privately, already measuring against the darkening sky. He had noticed the clouds stacking low in the southwest. He had said nothing, because sometimes the only thing worse than the storm coming is telling people the storm is coming before there is anything anyone can do about it. So he stood at the bow and watched the horizon, and let the others find their rhythm and breathe the salt air and feel for one last golden hour like the journey ahead was going to go the way journeys are supposed to go. The storm came on the 3rd night without warning or mercy. 1 hour the stars were out, brilliant and cold, scattered like salt across black cloth. The next, the wind arrived like something that had been waiting a long time, patient and purposeful, and the waves began to build in the slow, terrible way that means the ocean has made a decision and does not intend to be argued with. Thomas was below deck when the first great surge hit. He heard the crack before he felt it, a sound like the earth splitting at its foundation, and then the world tilted sideways, and gravity became a suggestion, and everything that was not bolted down became dangerous. He clawed toward the hatch. Salt water poured through every gap. The vessel shuddered and screamed and fought the way living things fight when they know they are losing. And then one massive, indifferent wall of water came down across the deck, and the ship simply gave way. Thomas went under. The cold hit him like a blow to the chest. The dark was absolute. The pressure closed in from every side, and somewhere above him, impossibly far, was the surface, and somewhere in the black water around him were 5 women who needed to reach it. He didn't think. He climbed. When he broke the surface, gasping, the storm was still raging, and the ship was gone. Not damaged, not drifting. Gone, swallowed by the water, as though it had never existed at all. He turned in every direction, calling their names into the dark, his voice swallowed almost immediately by wind and thunder. He swam toward every sound, every cry, every splash, every shadow in the heaving water, and one by one, through some mercy he would never find the right words to describe, he found them, bruised, bleeding, half drowned and shaking, but alive. He got them to shore before the sky began to lighten, pulling and guiding and pushing until all 5 of them had crawled out of the surf and collapsed onto the hard, wet sand. They lay there in the gray early light, too exhausted to speak, too relieved to weep, breathing in great ragged pulls like people returning from somewhere the living are not meant to go. Thomas sat among them and looked at the tree line, dark, dense, impenetrable, and felt the weight of where they were settle on him with a finality that left no room for argument. No smoke, no sound of axes or voices, no trail worn into the earth by human feet, just wilderness, pressing in from every side, ancient and indifferent and vast. They were alone, truly, completely alone. That first year nearly destroyed them, not because they lacked the tools to survive, but because survival, when it goes on long enough, begins to hollow a person out from the inside. But here is where those 6 chosen people revealed exactly why they had been chosen. Maggie moved first. Before the sun had fully risen on that first morning, she was already walking the perimeter of their stretch of shore, reading the land the way a general reads a battlefield, where the ground was high and dry, where the tree line offered protection from wind, where fresh water might be found inland. She organized their shelter with a speed and certainty that kept panic at bay in those first disorienting hours, directing everyone with the calm authority of someone who had decided, somewhere between the dark water and the shore, that falling apart was simply not an option available to her. Anna moved into the tree line before anyone had thought to ask her to. She walked slowly, deliberately, touching leaves and bark and soil, reading the island the way her grandmother had taught her to read the land back home. Within 2 days, she had identified enough safe food sources to keep 6 people alive indefinitely. She made no mistakes. She could not afford to. One error in judgment, one wrong plant handed to someone who trusted her, and the island would collect what the storm had failed to take. Rebecca established her infirmary on the 2nd day, a flat stretch of ground near the shelter, organized with the precision of someone who understands that chaos costs lives and order saves them. She had almost nothing to work with. What she had was memory and improvisation and the particular kind of calm that only people who have sat with suffering long enough develop. The calm that says, I cannot fix everything, but I will fix what I can, and I will not stop. Thomas worked. He was not the most skilled among them in any single discipline. What he had was something simpler and perhaps more rare. He did not stop. He was moving before the others woke, and still moving after they slept. He built what needed building, carried what was heavy, caught what they needed to eat, fixed what broke before it could become a crisis. He did these things without announcement, without waiting to be asked, without tallying what he was owed. But the thing he did that mattered most was harder to name and harder still to teach. When the fear came out sideways, and it did, regularly, inevitably, turning itself into anger over something small and petty and human, Thomas would simply sit himself down between. whoever was struggling in weight. He didn't lecture, didn't choose sides, didn't offer wisdom no one had asked for. He simply stayed, steady and present as a stone in a river, until whatever was burning inside the camp burned itself down to quiet. It was a small thing. In a desperate place, small things are everything. The 43rd day arrived like all the others. Gray light through the trees, the sound of the ocean, the smell of wood smoke and green growing things. Nothing announced it as the day that would change all of them forever. Rebecca had been quiet for several days, moving carefully, eating little. Thomas had noticed. He noticed everything, but had said nothing, giving her the space that private people need when they are working something out inside themselves. Then, on the afternoon of the 43rd day, she sat down near the fire, pressed one hand flat against her side, and went very still, in the particular way of someone who has run out of ways to keep a secret. Thomas was beside her before he had made a conscious decision to move. He asked no questions, just lowered himself to the ground next to her and waited, patient, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. When she looked at him, her eyes were calm. She told him plainly, in a low voice, without apology or explanation. She was with child, had been when they sailed. She hadn't told anyone because she hadn't known how, and then the storm had come, and then survival had consumed everything, and the truth had simply lived inside her, growing quietly, while everything else around her fought to stay alive. The silence that followed was the heaviest Thomas had ever sat inside. And then, slowly, one by one, the others spoke. Mary first, then Anna, then Maggie, her voice flat and steady, giving nothing away. Then Eliza, barely above a whisper. 5 voices, 5 truths, 5 lives growing quietly in the wilderness, in a place without a name, while the world went on without them. Thomas stood up slowly and walked to the waterline. The sun was going down across the water, painting everything in shades of copper and sorrow, and he stood at the edge of the surf with his hands at his sides and let the full weight of it settle onto him. He thought about the children coming into this silence, this isolation, this place without doctors or midwives or any of the things that civilization had built precisely because bringing life into the world is dangerous and uncertain and terrifying even when everything goes right. He thought about his own life, the house he had never built, the family he had imagined and set aside, the years of being useful to people who moved on, of being present for moments that belonged to someone else. He thought about what it meant to be a man with no claim on any of this, no blood tie, no obligation, no law that said this burden was his to carry. And then he thought about what it would mean to walk back to that fire and say nothing. To let 5 women face this alone because it wasn't technically his problem. He stood there a long time. The stars came out. The ocean moved, patient and enormous, without any opinion about what he decided. He walked back to the fire. They were all watching him. 5 faces in the firelight, each one carrying something different. Rebecca's steadiness, Mary's careful hope, Anna's quiet waiting, Maggie's iron certainty that still, just barely, held a crack of uncertainty running through it, and Eliza, young Eliza, who for once had stopped watching the world and was simply, plainly hoping. He looked at each of them in turn. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, the voice of a man who has chosen his words not for beauty, but for truth. "Ain't a one of you alone in this. Not now, not ever. We're going to see every one of these young'uns brought into this world safe. That's my word. No sermon, no ceremony, no grand gesture to the sky. Just a promise spoken by firelight on the 43rd day. And it was enough. The first birth came 7 months later, deep in the night, when the island was wrapped in a darkness so complete it felt like the whole world had held its breath. It was Rebecca herself, the one who had delivered the news that changed everything, who came first. The labor was long and hard, the kind that tests not just the body, but something deeper, something that lives underneath courage and only reveals itself when courage alone is not enough. Thomas kept the fire blazing through every hour of it, boiling water, carrying what was needed, his large, rough hands doing delicate things with a gentleness that surprised even him. When the moment came, when the cry broke the silence of the island for the very first time, he pressed his back against the tree behind him and closed his eyes and felt something move through him that he had no name for. He stayed for all 5 births, every single one. There were moments that tested him in ways he had not anticipated, moments when something went wrong, when the fear in the air became a living thing with weight and edges, when Rebecca's instructions came faster and her voice went tight, and Thomas had to will his hands to steadiness when everything inside him was anything but steady. There was one night, Anna's night, the 4th birth, long and frightening, when he sat outside on the ground with his head in his hands and made the same promise he had made at the fire, quietly to no one but himself and the dark, that he would not leave, that he would not stop, that whatever this cost him, he would pay it. Every child lived. 5 children, born into wilderness, into silence, into a place that had no name and no road and no memory of ever having held a human life before. Every single one of them alive. The years settled into something that none of them could have imagined when they had first dragged themselves onto that shore. The children grew the way children grow in wild places, fast and fearless, absorbing the island like it was their birthright. They learned the plants from Anna, who taught with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge, passed from hand to hand, is the most durable thing one human being can give another. They learned the stars from Thomas, who would sit with them on clear nights and trace the constellations slowly, his quiet voice naming them like old friends he was glad to introduce. They learned healing from Rebecca, stories from Eliza, endurance from Maggie. Mary drew their faces as they grew, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with a record of this impossible life, a life that the world outside would not have believed if they had been told about it. And every single day, without exception, Thomas climbed to the highest point of the island and lit a fire, a signal fire. Rain or shine, sick or well, hopeful or worn down to something that barely resembled hope, he lit it because he had made a promise, and a promise is not something you keep only when keeping it is easy. 7 years of mornings, more than 2,000 fires built and lit and tended by one man, alone on a hill, with no audience and no guarantee that anyone was ever going to see the smoke. He lit it anyway, every single day. He lit it anyway. On a morning in the 7th year, a merchant vessel appeared on the horizon. One of the crew noticed the smoke purely by chance, a thin, steady column rising from a place where no smoke had any business rising. They debated turning toward it. Time was money, and the smoke could mean anything or nothing. But something turned the wheel, some instinct that sailors learn to respect even when they cannot explain it, and the vessel changed course. What they found on that shore stopped every man on that crew cold. Not desperate survivors, not hollow-eyed wreckage of people hanging on by the last thread of their will. A life. A complete, improbable, fiercely built life. Shelters and gardens and pathways worn smooth by 7 years of daily use, and a community of 11 souls who had taken nothing and made something from it, who had stared down 7 years of isolation and chosen every single morning not to be diminished by it. 11 people walked out of the wilderness that morning. 5 women, 5 children, 1 man. One quiet, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed man who had spent 7 years being the thing that held all of it together. Not because he was required to, not because anyone was watching, but because on the 43rd day he had looked 5 women in the eye by firelight and given them his word. They went their separate ways, as people must, back to towns, back to the world, back to lives that had moved on in their absence the way the world always does, indifferent to the dramas of the people trying to live in it. The children stepped into civilization with wide eyes and strong bones, and a quality that people noticed immediately but struggled to name, a kind of groundedness, a quiet, unshakable confidence, the particular bearing of people who know exactly what they are made of, because they have already been tested and did not break. But once a year, without fail, they gather. No fixed place. Sometimes a meadow, sometimes a river bend, sometimes a stretch of quiet shore that reminds them, just faintly, of the place they came from. The children come back too, because they understand, even the youngest of them, that this gathering is the truest thing they do all year. They build a fire, always a fire, and they sit around it, and sometimes they talk, and sometimes they don't. And the firelight moves across their faces the way it moved across their faces on the island, and for a few hours the years fall away, and they are back on that shore, all of them together, the way they were when they had nothing but each other, and it turned out that was enough. Thomas sits beside the fire, a little older now, a little quieter if such a thing is possible. He watches the children, grown, beginning lives of their own, carrying the island inside them the way all of us carry the places that shaped us, and he feels something he spent most of his life not knowing he was waiting for. He feels at home. He doesn't talk much about the promise. He doesn't need to. The fire says it for him, the fire that he lit every single day for 7 years, alone on a hill, in a place no one was watching, for people who needed to believe that somewhere, someone was still trying to bring them home. He made a promise on the 43rd day, not because the law required it, not because blood demanded it, not because anyone would have blamed him if he had looked at those 5 women and said honestly that this was more than one man could carry. He made it because he was there, and he kept it because he was that kind of man. The quiet kind, the kind that works without applause and stands without being asked, the kind that lights the fire again in the morning, not because he is certain anyone is coming, but because certainty was never the point. The point was the promise. The point was the fire. The point was showing up every single day for the people counting on you, whether the world was watching or not. Thomas Hale never became famous. History did not write his name in the places it reserves for men it once remembered. He built no monuments, he won no wars, he gave no speeches that echoed down through the years. He just kept his word, on an island without a name, to people who needed him for as long as it took. And if you ask the children, now grown, now living their own full and complicated lives out in the wide world, if you ask them what they know for certain in a world that offers very little certainty, they will all tell you the same thing. They will tell you about a fire, lit every morning by a man who never stopped. If Thomas reminded you of someone in your life who showed up quietly, who held things together without asking for credit, who kept a promise no one else saw them keeping, then you already understand why Desert Heart exists. We tell these stories because they matter, because the world moves fast and loud, and the quiet ones get forgotten, and we believe with everything we have that they deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to Desert Heart right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Share it today with one person, just one, who needs to be reminded that showing up is enough, that keeping your word is enough, that being the kind of person who stays is one of the greatest things a human being can ever be. And leave us a comment below. Tell us, who is your Thomas Hale? Who showed up for you when they didn't have to? We read every single one. This story teaches what no classroom can fully deliver, that character is not what you do when people are watching, but what you do when no one is. Thomas Hale had every reasonable justification to limit his responsibility on that island. He owed these women nothing by law or blood or prior relationship, and yet he chose freely, deliberately, at real personal cost, to stand. That single choice is the most important lesson this story carries. It models for younger generations what genuine responsibility looks like when stripped of obligation and ego. It shows that love is not always romantic. Sometimes it is simply the sustained, daily decision to remain present for another human being in their most vulnerable hour, without reward, without recognition, without any guarantee that it will be enough. For older American audiences especially, this story affirms a set of values that many feel the modern world is allowing to quietly disappear: honor, endurance, faithfulness, and the deep belief that one steady person in the right place at the right moment can hold an entire world together. It is a story about community, about what human beings can build when they stop waiting for outside rescue and choose instead to become what each other needs. And it is, finally, a story about hope. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful kind that lights a fire every single morning, even when no ship has appeared in 7 years. Because sometimes hope is not a feeling. Sometimes hope is simply a decision you make again every morning until the day it turns out to have been right all along.